Well, good morning. I'm Amy Myhan. I'm one of the pastors here at Shepherd, and glad to be with you this morning as we wrap up our summer sermon series that we have been working through for, I think it's been 10 weeks now. We've been wandering together. We've been wandering towards promise. And so today we find it, and it's all fine, right? No, we have an amazing sermon series that we're launching. Leon will launch next week from the Gospels that will take us into the fall. But it is my privilege to wrap us up today because I was able to kick off this sermon series way back at the beginning of June. And so what we have learned in all of our wandering through Genesis is that there's lots and lots of family drama in these stories, right? There's enough complicated family dynamics to make all of us feel just a little bit better about our own family reunions. And that's part of what makes Genesis so compelling. Hopefully that's part of what you've taken away. But what I really want you to hear through these stories is that God keeps working through these imperfect people. And that's been the thread running through this whole series as we've been wandering toward promise. We began back in June with the story of Abraham from Genesis 12 and God's promise that I will bless you, and through you, I will bless the nations. That was the original promise that God made to Abraham. And we've watched that promise move through one imperfect generation after another, through Abraham, through his son Isaac, through his son Jacob. And now, the past couple of weeks, we've been talking about Jacob's sons. And so if you have been paying attention, you probably have made note of something important, that God seems remarkably comfortable, totally unbothered to do God's work through people who are complicated and wounded and sometimes just plain foolish, right? And so that's good news for us. It's been good news for us every single week because these stories in Genesis are ultimately not stories about a perfect family. It's a story about a faithful God. The focus has not been on these heroes of the faith, these individuals, but instead the faithful God that they have followed. And so today, that story does come full circle in sorts as we continue on the story through Joseph. Last week, Leon set up this story with Joseph and his many brothers and told us how his brothers had decided they had had enough of this little brother. Joseph was Jacob's favorite, one of the youngest sons of Jacob, and one of his first of two sons with his beloved wife, Rachel. And so Joseph was the son of Jacob who received the famous coat that we've heard referred to as the coat of many colors. He was the dreamer. He dreamed about his future greatness, and he wasn't always terribly humble with those dreams. He shared them with his family. He shared them with his big brothers. And if you have any siblings in your family, you can imagine about how well that went over. Jacob came home and would tell his brothers how one day his dreams revealed that one day they would all bow down to him in one way or another. And so that didn't go over well. And so the brothers really despised him. And eventually they came up with a plan to get rid of him. They threw him into a pit. They sold him into slavery. This is all review from last week. They went home and they took his bloodied coat and showed their dad, Joseph has been killed. He's been ripped apart by wild animals. Here's the evidence to prove it. And that was supposed to be the end of Joseph's story. But it wasn't. It wasn't. A little foreshadowing to this week. Joseph was sold into slavery. He ends up in Egypt. I'm going to fill in real quickly the story from where it ended last week to where we pick it up in our scripture this week, because the story of Joseph covers chapters and chapters and chapters. And so the quick catch up is that Joseph ends up in Egypt, in this foreign land, but he does well for himself. He ends up in the household of Potiphar. a rich man. He's serving Potiphar, and we don't know everything about Joseph, but we probably can infer he was pretty handsome, pretty good looking, because Potiphar's wife took a liking to Joseph. And just to keep this PG-13, I will say that she made some advances on Joseph. He rebuffed them, and then he was falsely accused of attempted rape. And so he ended up in prison in a turn of events where he was falsely accused. He ended up in prison. And in prison, he dusted off his whole dream interpretation skills, and he was able to interpret dreams of his fellow prisoners, which was beneficial to him in the future. Because eventually, after he spent many years in prison, the Pharaoh heard about him through some of his fellow prisoners. And Pharaoh was told when he needed a dream interpreter, hey, this guy Joseph is pretty good at that. So he's like, bring him to me. And so Joseph ended up interpreting the dreams of the Pharaoh of all of Egypt, and he predicted that 7 years of abundance would occur in the land, followed by 7 years of famine. And that was the key to Joseph's future, because this young Hebrew slave who was a prisoner then became, in Pharaoh's house, one of the most powerful people in all of Egypt. Joseph was put in charge of preparing the nation for this upcoming famine. He was put into power. And so years later, that famine, his dream came true. That famine reached the land of Canaan, which is the land of his ancestors, and Jacob's family and his brothers and their descendants. And so it comes full circle that the famine reached the land of Canaan, and Jacob's family is hit hard. Jacob sends his other sons, Joseph's older brothers, to Egypt to see if they can get some help, some food relief. He sends them to Egypt to buy grain. And so when they arrive, yes, they stand before the man in charge of all the grain supply of all of Egypt, which happens to be Joseph. Okay, all right, we're almost there. We're almost caught up. They don't recognize him. It's been years, but Joseph recognizes them. I mean, you don't forget the faces of the brothers that threw you in the pit, right? Okay, so here's where the story gets a little bit complicated. You're like, already? Like, it wasn't complicated already? But here it gets a little bit stickier, because Joseph has the power. Joseph has the authority. Joseph has security. And the tables have turned, because these brothers, these bullies, are standing in front of him with nothing. And Joseph is faced with a choice. And so that's where we begin our story today, with Joseph having to decide, is he going to use his power to settle the score, or is he going to break the cycle? That brings us to today's passage, which comes from Genesis chapter 45. This is the first 15 verses of chapter 45, as Joseph is standing in front of the brothers. Here we go. Joseph could no longer control himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried out, "Send everyone away from me." Everyone else who was in the room, he sent them away. And so no one stayed with him, and Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him. So dismayed were they that they were standing in his presence. And so Joseph said to his brothers, "Come closer to me." And they came closer. And he said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed." Don't be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. Because you sold me here, but God sent me before you to preserve life. God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in this land for these 2 years, and there are 5 more years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. But God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh and Lord of all his house and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Hurry and go up to my father and say to him, thus says your son Joseph, God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not delay. You shall settle in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, you and your children and your children's children, as well as your flocks, your herds, all that you have. I will provide for you there. Since there are 5 more years of famine to come, so that you and your household and all that you have will not come to poverty. And now your eyes and the eyes of my brother Benjamin see that it is my own mouth that speaks to you. You must tell my father how greatly I'm honored in Egypt and that all you have seen. Hurry and bring my father down here. Then he fell upon his brother Benjamin's neck, and he wept, while Benjamin wept upon his neck. And he kissed all his brothers, and he wept upon them. And after that, his brothers talked with him. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. I bet they talked. I bet they had a few things to say for themselves. I mean, can you imagine being in that moment? Being in that moment with these men who have carried the memory of what they did for all of these years. And then suddenly the brother that they assumed was dead, long gone, is standing in front of them. He's not only alive, but he's the man. He's powerful. He's powerful enough to decide their fate. He is powerful enough to decide what happens next. And Joseph says, come closer. That's the first thing he says, come closer. Not get away from me, not you're going to pay for what you did, but come closer. And he says, I am your brother, Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. Notice what he does. This is important. He doesn't pretend that it didn't happen. He doesn't try to rewrite the history. He doesn't say, oh, remember that time you threw me in the pit and you thought I was dead? Don't worry about it. Yeah. He doesn't say that. He admits what happened. He states, you sold me. Forgiveness doesn't require us to deny the truth. What we learn here from Joseph is that forgiveness begins with telling the truth about what had happened. But then once he does that, Joseph says something astonishing. He says, don't be distressed. Don't be angry with yourselves because you sold me here, because God sent me before you to preserve life. It's an important part of that verse. God sent me before you to preserve life. Now we have to be careful with that sentence, because Joseph's not saying that what his brothers did was good. He's not saying that God wanted them to do what they did. He's not saying that God had planned for them to throw him into a pit. He's not saying that being sold into slavery was part of God's plan. And he's not saying that that betrayal doesn't matter because something eventually good came out of it. There's a difference between saying God caused this and saying God was faithful even here. And I think that's an important distinction for us to make. I think it's essential because Joseph looks back over his life and he realizes something he could not have possibly seen when he was sitting at the bottom of that pit. He sees that God had been faithful and at work all along. Not because every terrible thing that happened was God's will or part of God's plan, but because God's faithfulness was bigger than every terrible thing that happened. The brothers' actions were real, and they were heinous. The betrayal was real. The suffering was real. The injustice was real. And yet none of those things had the final word. God kept making a way. And I think that's one of the deeper meanings of this promise that we've been following and wandering towards all through Genesis. Because way back when God says to Abraham, I will bless you and through you I will bless nations. It sounds first like he's just promising him many descendants, and that's part of it. It is. But it's also a promise about God's faithfulness through these generations of descendants. And we're seeing that come full circle in this story today. And what we discover is that the promise has been constantly in peril. Week after week after week, this promise has been in danger and threatened because right off the bat, Abraham and Sarah were old and barren up to that point. Isaac and Rebekah had a divided household. Jacob deceived his brother. And then now Jacob's sons are nearly destroying their own family by selling Joseph into slavery. There's external factors like famine and grief and betrayal. All these threats, all these are moments when we might reasonably wonder, now, how is God ever going to fulfill this promise? How is God going to get us from here to there? How is God going to fulfill a promise through these people? Because God's promise is not fulfilled through a family that gets everything right. It's fulfilled through a family that keeps being given another chance by a faithful God. Over and over and over, God keeps making a way. Most of the time, it's made through the most unlikely of people. And in this case, through a Hebrew slave sold into Egypt who rises to power. The brother who was thrown into the pit becomes the person who saves his brothers and his family and future generations from starvation. The one who is rejected becomes the one who provides. The one who was treated as disposable and thrown away becomes the one through whom God preserves life. The story turns, and suddenly we see the whole thing differently. Yesterday, Shane and I drove to College Station and moved in our middle child, Cole, back into a house for his junior year at A&M. And as we were driving home together, as he often does on Saturdays, Shane said, "How you feeling about your sermon?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, it's okay. I said, I haven't been able to come up with like a contemporary application though. Usually there's an anecdote or a story that comes to me and I said, I'm looking for something that proves like the middle of the story doesn't necessarily predict the end of the story. And we talked a little bit and every story we could think of was like too complicated to flesh out in an already kind of long sermon when there's hot dogs waiting. And so I took all that into consideration. And as if by magic, as we were driving along, I came up on my playlist this song. And it's never magic, by the way. It's always the Holy Spirit. So I started humming along to this song, and I started paying attention to the lyrics in a way that I probably hadn't in a while. And so when I got home last night, I looked it up, and after being really depressed at seeing what year this song came out, because basically a golden oldie now. But from 2001, you might remember this song, The Middle, from Jimmy Eats World. Okay, you're hearing it in your head. It's really upbeat. It's kind of a pop, punky song. And so here's the chorus. It just takes some time. Little girl, you're in the middle of the ride. Everything will be just fine. Everything will be all right. So I'm like, I wonder who they were talking to, who that song was meant for. So I did a quick little research, and I don't know if this is true or not, but we're going to pretend that it is. The lead singer for this song wrote this to a fan, like a 13-year-old girl who had sent in a fan letter saying that she didn't feel like she fit in middle school. Spoiler alert, nobody feels like they fit in middle school. That's why it's called The Middle. But I like that because it puts these lyrics in a new perspective, right? Like what you're feeling right now, it's not going to last. It gets better, right? It gets better. And so if you know this song, you're going to be humming it the rest of the day. You're welcome. It's a little bit of an earworm. But I do think that's a contemporary tie-in that teaches us something about faith, something that we can learn from this story, that we're always living in an unfinished story, right? Whether we're 13 or 30 or older, we're always living in the middle of our story. We don't get to know what number chapter we're in. we don't get to even read ahead. We don't get to know what today's disappointment is going to look like 10 years from now, 20 years from now. And we certainly don't get to know how God is going to use what's broken. But what we can learn from these ancient stories is that God knows. Joseph didn't know. Joseph didn't know when he was in the pit or Potiphar's house or in prison. He couldn't have looked around and said, yeah, someday God is going to use all of this for good. He couldn't know it for sure. Because faith is just rarely that clear in the middle, in the moment. Faith is trusting the faithfulness of God when the story is not yet finished. That's what we can learn from these stories in Genesis. And that brings us to a deeper message here in this closing story of Joseph. It brings us to forgiveness. Because Joseph has every reason not to forgive his brothers. He has every reason not to forgive his brothers, and yet he does. But it's important that we notice Joseph's forgiveness is not just sentimental. It's not cheap. He doesn't just say, hey, it's all fine, it's all fine. He tells the truth about what happened. And then he makes the conscious decision not to let what happened determine what happens next. That's forgiveness. Forgiveness isn't saying that the wound didn't matter. Forgiveness is saying that the wound will not write the rest of my story. One of my favorite authors, Anne Lamott, famously describes forgiveness as giving up hope of having a better past. Giving up hope of having had a better past. And I think Joseph understands this because he knows he can't go back. He can't climb back into that pit and rescue his younger self. He can't undo what's been done to him. He can't erase the years of slavery or the loneliness of prison. He can't make his brothers be the brothers that he wishes he had had. But he can decide what kind of future can come from that past. And that's a kind of freedom. That's a kind of luxury that Joseph gives himself. Because sometimes we talk about forgiveness as though it's primarily something that we do for the other person, to forgive them. But Joseph shows us that forgiveness is also about our own freedom. Because when someone harms us, we can become tethered to that harm. We replay the conversation, we rehearse what we wish we'd have said, we imagine what we'd say if we ever get the chance, and we carry that injury into new circumstances and into the future, into new future relationships. And sometimes we found that we've organized our entire lives around something that someone did to us in the past. And eventually the person who hurt us may not even know how much space or power that they occupy in our brains and our lives. And that's another kind of bondage. I mean, Joseph had literally experienced bondage. He had been in chains, imprisoned. But by the time in his story the brothers are standing before him, Joseph understands that there's another kind of chain he has the power to break. He can refuse to spend the rest of his life being defined by what his brothers did to him. And forgiveness then becomes a way of saying, what happened to me is part of my story, but it's not the author of my story. God is the author of my story. And I want to say something else about forgiveness. This is important, and I think sometimes we get this wrong, especially in churchy spaces. Forgiveness is not the same thing as reconciliation. Forgiveness doesn't mean that we return ourselves to an unsafe situation. It doesn't mean that there's not consequences. It doesn't mean that trust must instantly be restored. It doesn't mean that something we call good was not genuinely, that we call something good that was genuinely harmful. And it certainly doesn't mean that every relationship has to look exactly like it did before. Forgiveness is not pretending. Forgiveness is freedom. And reconciliation, when it's possible, when it's healthy, is the work of building something new. going forward. Joseph, he does more than simply forgive his brothers. He invites them into a new future. You might have heard in this passage, he promises them that you shall come here and settle in this land, and you shall be near me, you and your children and your children's children and your flocks. Like, bring every goat. I want you here. I want you close, near me. Joseph doesn't simply release them from punishment. He makes room for them in the future. He starts building a new future. And this is where forgiveness becomes part of God's larger promise, this promise we've been wandering towards. Joseph is not just forgiving a few brothers, he's helping preserve that family. And through that family, through these generations, God is preserving the promise made to Abraham. And that's how we close this full circle today, because that promise that was originally made to Abraham is still moving. This story is still unfolding. The family is still imperfect, and God is still faithful. And there's something deeply comforting about that. Lest we imagine that God's work depends on us getting it all right. Genesis tells us otherwise. God's promise survives human failure, not because failure doesn't matter. It matters, but God's grace is larger. Abraham is imperfect. Isaac is imperfect. Jacob is imperfect. Joseph is imperfect. His brothers are certainly imperfect. And somehow through all of them, each and every one, God keeps moving forward, moving us towards promise. The Old Testament is not a story about God rescuing perfect people. It's a story about God refusing to give up on imperfect humans. And this ancient story becomes so familiar because we recognize that kind of family, right? We still hurt one another. We misunderstand one another. We carry old resentments. For years, we make choices that we wish we could undo. We still find ourselves in pits that we didn't choose. Leon challenged us to dwell on that a bit last week. We are constantly wandering, but as we wander, we hear God say, I am not finished with you yet. I am not finished writing this story. And there's one more part of Joseph's story that didn't come up in our text, but it's important. I want to bring it in because this story keeps going. And in chapter 50, years later, after Jacob, the father, dies, Joseph's brothers become nervous again. Maybe they'd seen The Godfather, I don't know. But Jacob died, and they get nervous, and they think maybe Joseph's forgiveness was just an act to appease his father, and now that he's gone, Joseph will finally get his revenge. Wouldn't that be human of him? But Joseph says to them, in Genesis 50, verse 20, even though you intended to do me harm, God intended it for good. Even though you intended this for harm, God intended it for good. And that sentence culminates this story. He doesn't pretend that their motives were pure. They weren't. And he doesn't say the harm wasn't real. It was. But God intended it for good. God took what was meant to destroy and somehow made it life-giving. That is the faithfulness of God. That is how redemption happens. This is a redemption story. And I just want to say it one more time in case you haven't heard me yet. Redemption is not the same thing as erasing the past. But redemption means that God can take this broken thing, these broken pieces, and use them to build something that we could never have imagined. He does that in Genesis, and then God takes the story one step further in the Gospels. Because eventually God will do this not merely through Joseph and the patriarchs, but through Jesus. Jesus too will be betrayed by those who are closest. Jesus too will be handed over to death. Jesus too will appear to have been defeated. And yet the Christian claim is that death does not get the final word. God brings life where human beings brought death. God brings reconciliation where there was betrayal. God brings resurrection where there was a grave. The story of Genesis points us towards the gospel. It gives us a glimpse of the God who is always working towards life. The God who can take what human beings mean for destruction and bend it somehow towards redemption. The God whose promises are bigger than any of our human failures. The God who's faithful even when we are not. We've wandered a long way this summer. We've seen how many times the road could have ended, but God keeps it going. God keeps calling, God keeps blessing, God keeps making a way where we see no way. And finally, through Joseph, we see that God's faithfulness requires something from us, perhaps. We'll be required to forgive. It may require us to let go of the story we wish we had lived. It may require us to stop allowing someone else's worst act to determine our future. It may require us to step out of our pits, to step out of the pit of resentment and into the freedom of a new beginning. Because forgiveness isn't the end of the story. It's a way of making room for the future story that God's still writing. The most important thing about this family, and our families, is that God chooses to work through us. Thank goodness God doesn't wait for the perfect family to come along or the perfect church or perfect people. God works with what God has and with people who are human like us and always learning and always wandering. People who are wounded. People who are sometimes the ones who've been hurt and sometimes we're the ones who have done the hurting. People who need forgiveness and people who need to offer forgiveness. People who desperately need to hear that the worst thing they've ever done is not the final word about who they are. That's the God we meet in Genesis. That's the God who makes these promises and fulfills them. Not because the people are perfect, but because God is faithful. And so, wherever we find ourselves this morning, whatever story you're in the middle of, if you're in the middle of a family story you don't know how to repair, if you're in the middle of a grief that you can't understand, if you're somewhere on the long road between where you've been and where you hope to be, just remember this. No matter what chapter we're in, God is not finished writing. The past is part of our story, but it doesn't have to be the defining word of our future. The people who wounded us don't get the final word. Your worst day does not define you. Because the God who made a promise to Abraham is still the God who's making a way, who's preserving life, bringing good out of what was meant for harm. So the God who calls us closer, who forgives, and who makes all things new. And so my friends, as we complete this summer sermon series, may we continue wandering towards promise, trusting that the story is always bigger than the individual chapter we're living in. May it be so in your life and in mine. You pray with me. Gracious and faithful God, you have carried your people out of pits and out of prisons through wandering and waiting, through promises that we could see and promises that we could only trust with our hearts. We give you thanks for all these stories, for the reminder that our lives are never beyond your reach. When we cannot see the way forward, help us trust your faithfulness. When we carry our old wounds, give us the courage to forgive. And when we've caused harm, give us humility to seek forgiveness and strive towards reconciliation. And when we're tempted to believe that our failures, or someone else's, have written the final word, remind us that you are still at work, still making a way toward life. We pray all these things through Christ our Lord, who taught us to pray, saying, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into